Hey there, welcome back. Or maybe you're here for the first time, in which case, congratulations on stumbling into the quietest corner of medieval chaos. The kind of place where we whisper about burnt bread, boiling pots, and the human cost of feeding a castle full of people who somehow are always hungry. So go ahead, dim the lights, slide under something soft, maybe light a candle if you're feeling dramatic. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that smells like onions, wet stone, and very old butter. This is the not so glamorous, absolutely exhausting, and often dangerous life of a medieval castle cook. And let me tell you, if you thought working in a modern restaurant was stressful, the kitchen staff at Castle Kaufmore would like a word. Possibly a scream. Possibly while holding a cleaver. Now, when people think of castles, they imagine noble feasts, long wooden tables groaning under roasted boar, golden goblets of wine, music playing in the background, and everyone smiling with turkey legs in their hands like they're in a Disney movie. But what you don't see is what's happening below. Underneath all that merriment, buried deep in the stone belly of the castle, was a kitchen that never ever slept. And no, we're not talking about a cozy little rustic setup with an aga and a spice rack. We're talking multiple roaring fires, a spit turning 60-pound carcasses, open flames licking the walls, and exactly zero safety regulations. The kitchen was hot, dark, wet, crowded, and full of people who were one broken step away from becoming the stew. Picture this. You wake up before sunrise, not because you want to, but because someone's already shouting about flour. The first fire needs to be lit before the rooster even thinks about stretching. And this isn't just tossing in a log and flicking a lighter. No, this is fire by friction, flint, steel, and a kind of desperate whispering prayer that today's spark catches faster than yesterday's. If you're lucky, the embers are still smoldering from last night. If not, well, hope you brought your patience and possibly some dry moss. And once the fire's alive, you feed it. Constantly. Like it's a fussy toddler made of heat and rage. Because everything depends on the fire, the bread, the meat, the sauces, the boiling cauldrons of porridge. Yes, cauldrons, plural. Because you're not feeding a family of 4. You're feeding 3 dozen soldiers, a few noble guests, an entire noble family who has opinions about cheese, and half the village when the Lord's feeling generous. The kitchen hierarchy was brutal. At the top, the master cook, think Gordon Ramsay, but with more shouting, more sweating, and possibly wielding a ladle like a weapon. Below him, spit boys, turn broaches, scullery maids, larders, pantry boys, and roasting assistants, which sounds like a fancy title until you realize your job is to stand next to a wall of meat for 8 hours turning a hot iron crank until your arm feels like it belongs to someone else. Also, there were no fans, no breaks, no mental health days, just sweat, steam, and the constant smell of onions. Lots and lots of onions. Because here's the thing, medieval seasoning was a bit like a guessing game mixed with a dare. Salt, if you had it. Herbs, maybe. Spices, only if the Lord had returned from crusading or your kitchen was blessed by a traveling merchant with pepper. But onions were eternal. Onions were the backbone of cuisine. They went into everything. Broth, stew, bread, medicine, revenge plots, probably. And garlic. Garlic was the backup singer to Onion's solo act. Together, they formed the base of 80% of what came out of a medieval kitchen. The other 20%. Mystery, meat, and hope. Let's talk bread. Because bread was life. Bread was currency. Bread was also dangerously hard. The lower the rank, the staler the bread. Nobles got soft, fluffy, enriched loaves. You got something between a cracker and a brick, lovingly referred to as trencher bread. And if you didn't eat your trencher, someone else would. The rats, the dogs, that one kitchen boy who never blinked. Oh, and by the way, kitchen floors were not cleaned daily. Sometimes not even weekly. Things fell. Things stayed. Bread dropped. Bread returned. If it didn't walk off on its own, it was back on the plate. And let's not forget the feast days. Those glorious occasions where the lord of the castle decides, completely without warning, that tonight's dinner should include 3 courses, 6 roasted birds with feathers reattached for drama, a tower of pastries shaped like a mythical creature, and a pie that may or may not contain live frogs. Yes, that was a real thing. And you poor castle cook have about 5 hours to make it happen while your assistant has just dropped the eels and someone else has started a small fire with the butter. So what happens if the food isn't good? You get complaints. Or worse, whispers. The cook has lost his touch. The soup is watery. The roast was overdone. But let's be clear. This was a time when food poisoning wasn't just unpleasant. It was a potential death sentence. Salmonella didn't just ruin your day. It ruined your whole lineage. So the castle cook, he wasn't just a chef. He was a soldier on the front lines of biological warfare. Every dish had to be carefully prepared, cooked thoroughly, and if possible, taste like something. Not amazing, just something. And when the feasting was done, the torches put out, and the nobles stumbled off to bed, full and half-drunk. You cleaned. You scraped the pans. You doused the fires. You tossed the bones to the dogs, resalted the meat for tomorrow, and maybe, if you had time, washed your face in a bucket. Then you collapsed onto a straw mat near the scullery door and dreamed about onions, because in 5 hours it would begin again. So, you've survived the morning. The bread's in the oven. The porridge is bubbling. Someone hasn't set themselves on fire. Good job. But now comes the real work, the meat. Because in a medieval castle, meat wasn't just food. It was status. It was power. It was proof that your lord was doing just fine. Thank you very much. And you, as the cook, with a magician expected to turn a deer carcass into dinner and a pig's head into performance art. No pressure. Let's start with what's arriving at the kitchen door. You might imagine neat little cuts of sirloin wrapped in paper. No, what you're getting is a whole, freshly dead animal. Possibly still warm. Possibly still twitching. A boar, dragged in with its tusks still intact. A cow, quartered if you're lucky. A rabbit, still looks like someone's pet. You don't get a butcher. You are the butcher. You a blunt knife, a wooden table, and enough blood to make the local priest nervously adjust his collar. And let's not forget, there's no refrigeration. No walk-in freezer. No cold storage. Just hope. Hope and salt. Meat needed to be cooked fast or preserved faster. That meant salting, smoking, brining, or stuffing it into something else and pretending it would keep. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes dinner looked fine, smelled fine, and then 3 hours later, let's just say someone missed the evening prayer because they were busy dying in the latrine. Now let's talk about the spit. The great centerpiece of the medieval kitchen. A huge turning rod placed over a roaring fire, made for roasting whole animals. Deer, pigs, sheep, anything big enough to impress and greasy enough to feed 40 soldiers with bad table manners. Turning the spit wasn't automatic. It wasn't even mechanical. It was human. Specifically, a turn broach, usually a young boy or kitchen assistant, who sat for hours, slowly rotating the meat like a human rotisserie. If he slowed down, uneven roasting. If he nodded off, fire hazard. If he complained, fired. Possibly literally. The meat wasn't seasoned so much as unnegotiated with. A little salt if you had it. Maybe sage, thyme, or whatever herb was currently growing out of the cracks in the castle wall. For the nobles, a splash of expensive imported spices like cinnamon or clove. For everyone else, onion. Always onion. And if you were lucky, the animal wasn't already halfway to rancid by the time it hit the spit. Because the kitchen smelled. Oh, did it smell? Imagine layers of sweat, smoke, wet stone, blood, onion, old cheese, and just the faintest suggestion of mouse pee. Add to that the unmistakable perfume of someone boiling cabbage nearby, and you have yourself a medieval aroma that could clear a room or start a war. And let's not forget the mice. They were everywhere. The kitchen wasn't just hot and smoky. It was a rodent rave. Tiny feet on rafters. Nibbles in the flour sack. One bold mouse even made a nest in a pastry once. Everyone saw it. No one had time to fix it. The rule was simple. If it's small enough to bake and no one saw it escape, it's part of the meal now. You didn't talk about the mice. The mice didn't talk about you. It was a mutual arrangement based on denial and deadlines. But meat wasn't just meat. It was presentation. The nobles wanted drama, theater. They wanted their food to tell a story. That's how you ended up making swan pies, yes, with a neck arched elegantly out of the crust. Or baking birds into pastries that exploded into song when cut open. Once, someone even demanded a dish where a fish looked boiled but tasted roasted. Did that make sense? No. Was it your job to make it happen? Absolutely. And if you couldn't, well, hope you didn't get too attached to having eyebrows. Meanwhile, back in the scullery, pots boiling, bread burning. Someone dropped the butter. Again. A dog stole a duck leg and is now playing keep away with it under the table. The larder boy is missing, possibly inside the larder. And you, the castle cook, are expected to have it all under control. Keep in mind, the only communication is shouting, the only light is firelight, and the only schedule is now. Everything needs to be ready now. You manage. Somehow. You roast. You stew. You bake. You boil. You ladle something vaguely edible into 30 wooden bowls and pray it reaches the hall still warm. You mop your face with your sleeve, try not to trip over the cat, and ignore the growing suspicion that someone's taken a bite out of the honey cakes you specifically set aside for dessert. But then a bell rings. The food is served. The trays go up. The nobles begin to feast. Music plays. Jesters tumble. Everyone claps and laughs and chews with alarming enthusiasm. And for a brief, shining moment, no one's yelling your name. You take a breath. You stare at the embers. And then someone calls from the great hall. They like another course. Of course they would. Because this is a castle. And you, dear cook, are not a person. You are a kitchen ghost, steaming, sweating, chopping, stirring, a background hum of survival. And the only reward? Maybe a cold bowl of leftover stew at midnight. If the mice haven't gotten to it first. Let's say, by some small miracle, you've managed the meat. You've avoided burning the roast, didn't accidentally stew the Lord's prize goose, and no one tripped into the fire. Today's a win. But before you can wipe the sweat from your brow or consider collapsing near a bucket of dishwater, the steward enters, and he says, "The lady would like something sweet." You don't say. Not out loud, but internally your soul makes the sound of a collapsing sponge cake. Because medieval dessert wasn't dessert as we know it. It was more like alchemy, with a side of guesswork and occasional danger. Sugar, rare, imported, expensive, locked away, used only for guests who could spell the word duchy correctly and probably owned half of it. So cooks improvised. Honey was the most common sweetener, and by honey, we mean whatever the bees left behind in that fuzzy old sack in the corner that hopefully didn't also contain a wasp. Fruit was a treat, but seasonal, which meant half your options came pre-wilted and the other half were dried into chewy strips that vaguely resembled plums if you squinted and prayed. And then there was custard. Ah yes, medieval custard, a boiling pot of milk, eggs, and maybe some cinnamon if the pantry god smiled. Stirred slowly, thickened with worry, and poured into a crust that may or may not still contain a breadcrumb from last week's fish pie. Dessert was also about color. If it looked pale and boring, the nobles would eat it with all the enthusiasm of someone licking a rock. So the cook had to get creative. Beets, ground up and added for color. Saffron, if available, a golden miracle, one that cost more per ounce than most kitchen staff earn in a month. One inventive cook famously used crushed parsley to dye almond milk green, then told the guests it was enchanted by monks. They believed him, because everything was enchanted back then, or cursed, sometimes both. Let's not forget the marchpane. That's medieval marzipan, a sugary almond paste sculpted into animals, castles, fake fruits, and sometimes, for weddings, nude people. Yes, made of almond paste, served to your mother-in-law, with a straight face. The cook was expected to craft tiny edible swans, or maybe a knight on a marzipan horse, wielding a sugar sword, ready to battle a candy dragon. And you had 2 hours. And the marzipan kept melting. And someone had eaten the dragon's head when your back was turned. Of course they did. Then there were jellies. Oh yes, gelatin, or the closest thing to it, made by boiling animal bones and hooves for hours until you had a clearish sludge. Add wine, sugar, herbs, pour into a mold shaped like something strange, a fish, a castle, a saint. Chill in the coldest corner of the castle, and voila, wobbling dessert that smelled slightly of meat. A marvel, a masterpiece, a health hazard. But if it jiggled, that was enough. The truth is, most medieval sweets weren't sweet. They were confusing, like a tart filled with eggs, cheese, and rosewater, or pastries spiced with pepper and cumin, or gingerbread that could, in a pinch, be used as a building material. And that bread, that stubborn, unyielding, 10-day-old brick, it showed up in desserts too. Sometimes soaked in milk and honey to make a pudding. Other times crumbled and layered between apples and dried currants in something loosely referred to as a pie. Was it good? Sometimes. Was it edible? Mostly. Was it appreciated? Only by people who hadn't lost a tooth biting into it. And of course, mistakes happened. Once, the cook added too much vinegar to a sweetmeat dish. Another time, someone dropped a raisin tart into the stew. No one noticed. It stayed. And occasionally, someone with too much wine and not enough sense would demand something impossible. Bring me a sugared peacock. Bake a pie that sings. I want a cake shaped like the Virgin Mary. You blink. You nod. You return to the scullery and whisper to the onions. They understand. Presentation mattered just as much as flavor. If the dessert looked interesting, people would eat it or at least talk about it, which, in medieval terms, was close enough. Plates were decorated with flowers, herbs, or sometimes painted with actual gold leaf. That's right, gold. You might be sleeping on straw and praying not to get trench foot, but your pudding had bling. Because nothing says, this kingdom is stable, like a golden pie filled with raisins and existential dread. At the end of the meal, if the nobles were pleased, you might hear clapping, or a faint, murmured, not bad, and that would be your standing ovation. Then came cleanup. Scraping melted custard off trenchers, soaking pots in cold, greasy water, trying to convince the dogs to leave the marzipan night alone again. And by the time the last dish is stacked, the last fire is dying, and the kitchen falls quiet, you finally sit. Your knees ache. Your hands smell like onion, grease, and ash. You close your eyes, and then the steward returns. Breakfast. 6 hours, of course. There's an old saying in the kitchen. If nothing has caught fire by noon, check the bread. It probably burned at 10. Disasters were part of the routine for a castle cook. Big ones, small ones, ones that smelled bad, ones that exploded, and the occasional goose-related incident that defied all logic and left someone limping for a week. Let's begin with the most common disaster, fire. Medieval kitchens were basically danger wrapped in stone. You had open flames, wooden utensils, grease everywhere, and exactly 0 fire extinguishers. The closest thing to safety was a wet rag and someone who could shout water faster than the flames could reach the flour sacks. Most fires were small, manageable. A singed sleeve here, a charred roast there. But sometimes a log rolled, a curtain flared, a dog panicked, and suddenly you were holding a bucket barefoot, covered in butter, trying to explain to the steward why there's a hole in the ceiling. And the answer was always, the chicken ran through the coals and knocked over the pot. Of course it did. Then there was spoilage. Remember, no refrigeration, no Tupperware, no labels that said, consume by Thursday. Food had to be stored in dark, cool places, the pantry, the larder, or when those were full, that one weird corner near the staircase that smells like cheese and sorrow. If you salted the meat correctly, it kept. If not, well, the smell told you. Or the color. Or the fact that the dog, who usually ate everything, refused to go near it and gave you a concerned look. Mold? Common. Bugs? Inevitable. Rats? Practically part of the staff. Sometimes the spoiled food got thrown out. Sometimes, if the pressure was on, it got adjusted. A little more spice. A longer cook time. Fresh layer of gravy. And you prayed. Because if the Lord's cousin fell ill during dinner, everyone looked at the cook. And if you couldn't prove it wasn't the duck, you'd better hope you were fast enough to outrun a squire with a grudge. Let's talk about guests. Unexpected guests were the culinary equivalent of a thunderstorm in a leaky boat. They showed up unannounced, with appetites and opinions and food allergies no one had invented words for yet. You just served dinner, everything clean, fires banked, dough rising, when the steward would burst into the kitchen and whisper the words every cook dreads. They're here. And you'd scramble. You'd grab a cold pie from the pantry, warm it in the fire until the crust didn't crack when you looked at it. You'd throw some greens on a plate and pretend they were intentional. You'd cut the burnt edge off the roast and pray no one recognized the shape of the chicken that had tried to escape last week. Oh, and yes, animals escaped. Frequently. The kitchen was a zoo on its best day. Chickens flapping underfoot, dogs begging, cats stalking mice, a pig in the courtyard for slaughter, until it decided it no longer believed in fate and ran for its life. Once, a cow got loose and wandered into the bakery. Another time, a goose escaped mid-basting, ran into the great hall, and interrupted a wedding proposal. Legend says the cook simply wiped her hands on her apron and said, well, at least it was fresh. There were also supply issues. Sometimes the grain shipment was late. Sometimes the eggs were missing. Sometimes the wine was borrowed by the steward who swore he was just checking it. You learned to adapt. No eggs, more flour. No flour, use breadcrumbs. No breadcrumbs. Hope they're too hungry to notice. Cooks didn't get the good stuff. That went to the nobles. You got the bent carrots, the cracked onions, the fish that stared at you with just a bit too much attitude. And somehow you were expected to make a miracle out of it. And then there were the critics. A noblewoman with a sensitive stomach. A knight who didn't like mustard. A monk who claimed your stew, gave him visions. Everyone had an opinion. And they expressed it. Loudly, often mid-chew. Your food was too salty. Not salty enough. Too hot. Too cold. Too peasant wine. As if there was a secret seasoning cabinet labeled aristocrat. You smiled. You nodded. You sharpened your knives. Not for violence. Just for the roast. Mostly. But through it all, you endured. You adjusted. You improvised. You pretended not to hear the argument happening in the great hall because someone thought your goose stew looked judgmental. Disasters came and went. Fires got put out. Spoiled food became soup. Escapee chickens became legend. Because a castle cook wasn't just a cook. They were a disaster manager. Problem solver. A peacekeeper in a world where onions were currency and flour was a form of therapy. And as you scraped burnt pudding off the hearth and wiped your face with a soot-covered sleeve, you whispered to no one, "Tomorrow will be better. Probably." Here's a fun fact. Medieval castle kitchens didn't have clocks. They didn't need them. Because time wasn't measured in hours, it was measured in meals. Wake up, time for breakfast prep. Fire dying, time to panic. Bell ringing, time to serve. Sun going down, time to start again. If you were the castle cook, your day didn't start. It just resumed. And it didn't end. Not really. You just fell asleep near a bucket and hoped no one needed pie in the next 4 hours. Most days began before dawn. You'd roll off a straw mattress or a warmish patch of floor and begin the ancient ritual of, "Please let there be embers left in the hearth." If there were, you gently nursed them back to life. If not, you muttered something unholy and started from scratch, striking flint and praying the wind didn't betray you. Again. All before most of the castle had even turned over in their fancy feather beds and dreamt of goose pate. Once the fire was alive, it was non-stop motion. Bread to knead, gruel to stir, chickens to chase, water to fetch. And mind you, fetching water wasn't just turning on a tap. You walked to the well. You heaved a bucket. You hoped it didn't slosh out on the way back. And you did this dozens of times a day. And yes, your back hurt. Always. No one asked, "How's your spine today, cook?" They just asked, "Where's the soup?" Mid-morning brought the first real test, breakfast service. Not a casual bowl of cereal. More like porridge for 50 warmed meat scraps for the steward, honeyed oats for the noble children, and something called ale bread that tasted like a dare. And by the time breakfast was served, you were already prepping for lunch, which was often the largest meal of the day. That meant roasting, boiling, baking, skewering, layering, stuffing, slicing, arguing, sweating, and remembering halfway through that you forgot to start the fish. You ran. Always. Even when walking. Your knees became suggestions. Lunch came, went. Plates returned scraped, cracked, sometimes suspiciously chewed. No thank yous. No notes of appreciation. Just dirty dishes and a pile of bones the size of a medium goat. You scraped, sorted, wiped. And then, dinner. Dinner wasn't always as grand as lunch, unless the Lord had guests. Then it became a full production. Soup, meat, bread, sweets. Candles lit. Torches flickered. And somewhere in the distance, someone screamed because they spilled the gravy on the carpet. Meanwhile, you, a smear of flour and fatigue, were juggling 3 courses and mentally counting spoons because 2 went missing last time and the steward still hasn't forgiven you. You smiled through it all. The cook's smile. Half pride, half please let this be over. Evenings in the kitchen were quieter, but not restful. This was when you salted tomorrow's meat, stoked the fires for overnight warmth, checked the larder, checked it again, wondered what happened to the rest of the cheese, decided not to ask. You soaked pots in greasy water, swept ashes off stone, and maybe, just maybe, snuck a cold crust of bread into your mouth without anyone noticing. Your feet ached, your shoulders throbbed, but your mind, still spinning, because you had to remember. The nobleman doesn't eat pork. The knight hates leeks. The baby needs boiled milk. And the Lord's wife wants something light but rich, which makes no sense, but okay. Sleep was a rumor. Maybe a few hours in the corner. Maybe upright against the wall. Maybe you didn't sleep, just sat very still until your body pretended it was unconscious. And when you did sleep, you dreamed of onions, of spilled flour, of your name being shouted from across the castle again and again, until you woke up in a panic, already halfway to the pantry. The castle cook didn't live by a normal rhythm. They lived in the in-between, between fire and ash, between roast and ruin, between pride and punishment. They didn't get seasons, just menus. They didn't get holidays, just more guests. And yet, every day, they showed up, because someone had to feed the hungry beast that was the castle. Someone had to make sure the stew didn't boil over, the bread didn't collapse, and the guests didn't die. And that someone was always the cook. Let's talk about popularity. Not the kind you find on court gossip scrolls. Not the kind that earns you favor with knights and noble ladies. No, the kind of popularity you get when everyone in the castle knows your name, because they want something. Because the castle cook wasn't famous. They were necessary, like walls, or chamber pots, or that one weird squire who always smells faintly of turnips. Being the cook meant knowing everyone, and no one. You heard secrets, saw affairs unfold over spilled wine, noticed who sat where at the table, and what it meant when they didn't. You knew when the steward was annoyed, when the lady of the house was fasting but sneaking pastries, when the stable boy had a crush on the scullery maid and was trying to impress her with stale biscuits. You noticed everything because you were there, in the background, always watching, stirring, chopping. No, but friendships? Rare. You didn't have time for deep conversation. You barely had time to eat. Besides, the kitchen was its own world. A loud, sweaty, chaotic bubble of smoke, knives, bread crusts, and arguments about whether the turnips were supposed to be that color. You trusted your assistant, sure, but you also knew they'd sell your pie recipe to the baker for 2 silver and a warm place to nap. Romance? Hilarious. Unless you considered whispered glances over a pot of eel stew romantic, which some people did. We're not judging. But mostly love didn't happen in the kitchen. Burns happened. Knife slips. bread dough disasters, and the last thing anyone wanted while roasting a pig was emotional vulnerability. Still, the cook had power. Not courtly power. Not change the kingdom power. But the kind of subtle, simmering influence that came from being the only person who knew what was in the soup. Because when you control the food, you control the mood. Bad meal, bad day, good meal. Suddenly, everyone thinks the weather's nicer and the Lord's jokes are funnier. You could ruin someone's week with overcooked mutton, or elevate your status with a perfect honey cake. And if someone crossed you, well, people talked about that time the steward insulted the cook and spent 3 days visiting the latrine. Was it the stew? Was it justice? Who's to say? There were rare moments of connection. A kitchen assistant humming while peeling carrots. An old scullery maid sharing a tip for souring cream just right. A bread boy handing you a crust, still warm from the fire, without saying anything at all. Small things, quiet things, human things. Sometimes that was enough. But mostly your company was food. You talked to the stew, whispered to the dough, argued with the onions like they owed you money. You sang songs to the chickens before they were dinner. You made jokes with the bread. Not good jokes, but the bread didn't mind. And when things got really bad, when the meat spoiled, the guests complained, and the fire refused to light, you'd stop, take a breath, and say something like, "All right then, again," and start over. Because the food never judged you. It just needed you. Still, once in a while, you catch a moment. A nobleman smiling mid-bite. A child sneaking a biscuit and giggling. The entire hall falling silent after the first taste of your spiced apple tart. And in that quiet was pride. You didn't need applause. You had the spoon. And the spoon was enough. You see, the castle cook wasn't just a laborer. They were an artist, a manager, a therapist, a spy. They kept secrets in saucepans and solved problems with salt. They fed the castle, shaped its mood, and held it together one meal at a time. No one toasted them at feasts. No one wrote ballads in their honor. But they were there, beneath the stone, beyond the fire, in every bite. Let's talk about expectations. Because if you've ever watched a medieval movie or flipped through a fantasy cookbook, you might think castle folk were feasting on endless banquets of roasted swan, golden apples, and meat served in jewel-encrusted goblets by someone with perfect hair and suspiciously clean hands. Yeah, no. Most days, the castle cook's menu didn't include glory. It included whatever we have left that hasn't gone off and doesn't have visible legs. Welcome to the actual medieval diet. First, let's clear something up. They didn't eat turkey. Turkeys are from the Americas, and Europe hadn't stumbled across that continent yet. So no, there was no medieval Thanksgiving, no cranberry sauce, and definitely no stuffing that came out of a box. What they did eat, though, was game, if they were rich enough. Venison, boar, pheasant, rabbit, even swan and peacock. Yes, those were real dishes, and yes, sometimes they reattached the feathers for decoration because medieval nobles were nothing if not dramatic. But those meals, reserved for the top 1% of the 1%. Everyone else ate stew. Stew was the hero of the peasant and the backbone of the kitchen. It started with water, always questionable. Add whatever was available: barley, onions, root vegetables, maybe a bit of yesterday's bread. Toss in a bone. Stir. Simmer. Ignore for 7 hours. Stir again. Meat? Optional. Hopeful. Rare. Most of the time, Stew was vegetarian by necessity, not design. Carrots, leeks, turnips, cabbage. More cabbage. Always cabbage. Cabbage for breakfast. Cabbage for dinner. Cabbage in your dreams. Cabbage in your nightmares. The castle cook got very good at making cabbage feel like a plot twist. What about bread? Oh yes, bread was everywhere. But not all bread was created equal. The nobility got soft, white bread made with fine flour. You got something lovingly referred to as maslin, a hearty combo of wheat, rye, and despair. It was coarse. It was chewy. It occasionally had gravel in it. Not by mistake. That was just how they ground the grain, between actual stones. Medieval dentistry was minimal. So the bread fought back. Now here's a fun surprise. They drank a lot of alcohol. Water wasn't always safe, so ale, beer, and weak wines were common, even for children. Before you gasp, know this, most of it was small beer, low in alcohol, high in hydration and vaguely oat-flavored. And milk. If it wasn't spoiled within 2 hours, congratulations, you own a miracle cow. Cheese was a safer bet. Hard, salty, tangy cheese that smelled like wet hay and ambition. Perfect with stale bread. Or alone. Or when you needed to barter for firewood. Cheese was currency, especially if it didn't have mold growing a personality. As for fruit, seasonal, dried, stewed, or fermented. If it was spring, you had berries. If it was winter, you had regrets. Nobles sometimes had imported fruits like figs and dates. These were treasures. You didn't just eat a date, you announced it. Would you care for a fig? Oh my stars, a fig. Are we royalty now? And then there were spices. We imagine medieval food as bland. But for the wealthy, it was a fireworks show. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, black pepper, all imported, all expensive, all used in ways that make no sense now. They put cinnamon in meat pies, pepper in desserts, sugar and vinegar in everything. The flavors weren't subtle. They were loud, confused, bold, like a dinner party hosted by someone who had only skimmed a recipe once, in Latin. For the cook, it was part art, part panic, and part just throw something in before the guests arrived. What did they eat? Well, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, chilies, corn, all New World foods, completely unknown in medieval Europe. So if you see a knight in shining armor dipping French fries in ketchup at a feast, congratulations, you're watching historical fiction with the accuracy of a dream. And no forks. They ate with spoons, knives, and hands. And they shared plates. 1 plate, 2 people. Intimacy, medieval style. So what was the castle cook really making? Soup, bread, stews, pies filled with everything from fish to fruit to mystery. Pottage, which was basically yes. Gruel, which was no, but okay. They layered leftovers, reused crusts, turned scraps into sauce. And when nobles demanded fancy feasts with rare dishes and exotic flair, the cook smiled, nodded, and quietly turned the cabbage into a swan. Again. Because behind the scenes of all those glorious candlelit banquets, beneath the music, the toasts, the laughter, there was one person who knew the truth. That the swan was just cabbage. That the fig came from a merchant 2 weeks late. That the bread had gravel in it. And that dinner didn't appear by magic. It came from sweat, fire, spice, and sheer stubborn will. From the castle cook. At some point, maybe in your 10th year in the kitchen, maybe after your 50th roast, maybe the first time you wept quietly while scrubbing stew off a spoon, you realized something. You were invisible, not ignored, not disrespected, just unseen. Because the castle needed food, but not the face behind it. It needed meals, not memories. And you, the cook, became part of the furniture. Warm, reliable, always slightly damp. Like the hearth, or the mop bucket, or the smell of onions that never left your skin. You worked behind stone walls, beneath heavy beams, in a room where sunlight rarely touched. While the noble children danced, you stirred. While the soldiers sang, you chopped. While the ladies laughed, you sweated in silence. It wasn't cruel. It just was. This was the life you had. This was the life you kept. And eventually, the silence became familiar. There were moments, of course. A young boy helping you knead dough and calling you master of bread. A noblewoman sneaking into the kitchen after a long day, asking for a taste of that almond cream you make so well. A stable hand offering you the soft end of a loaf with a grin and no reason. Small things, quiet kindnesses, but they didn't change the truth. You lived in the shadows so that others could bask in the light. And yet you stayed. Why? Because in the shadows you found control. Out in the great hall, life was chaos. Politics, betrayal, blame, titles and taxes and ceremonies that went on too long. But in the kitchen, the rules were clear. Fire needs fuel. Bread needs time. Meat needs turning. If you followed the rhythm, things worked. Mostly, there was beauty in that. Simplicity, even power. Because if the food didn't come, the castle stopped. So you held your head high figuratively. Literally, your neck probably hurt from years of leaning over pots. But still, there was pride. Pride in knowing how to stretch a single onion across 3 meals. Pride in keeping the fire alive during a storm. Pride in hearing laughter in the great hall and thinking, that was my stew. No one clapped. No one toasted. No one carved your name into a song. But the castle moved because you did. And that mattered. Of course, there were doubts. On the coldest mornings. On the loneliest nights. When your hands cracked from heat and your knees whispered curses in your sleep. You'd wonder, is this it? Is this all I'll ever be? A name no one remembers. A face behind steam. A cook. Just a cook. But then you'd remember. The roast you rescued from the edge of disaster. The child who licked the spoon and smiled. The soldier who asked for seconds. Twice. And you'd nod. Yes, this is enough. Because in a world ruled by crowns and swords, there was another kind of royalty, quiet, grease-stained, and barefoot. The royalty of resilience. Of showing up every day. Of feeding the angry, the joyful, the broken, the bored. Of turning hunger into happiness, one wooden bowl at a time. You didn't wear a crown. You wore flour. You didn't carry a scepter. You carried a ladle. But you ruled something all the same. A kingdom of fire and food and fierce, unspoken love. And in the stillness of the late-night kitchen, long after the last guest had gone to bed, you'd sit beside the dying embers and whisper to the pots, "We did good today." And the pots, if they could speak, would whisper back, "You always do." You'd think, after all the boiling and baking, roasting and rushing, a cook might get to step outside once in a while. Not for long. just long enough to feel the sun. Smell something that isn't onions. Remember, there's a world beyond flour and fire. But for most castle cooks, that moment came rarely, if ever. Because once you became part of the kitchen became part of you. Sure, there were days when you carried a basket to the market, collected herbs from the edge of the forest, or helped select a pig from the farmer at the gate. But even then, you weren't outside. You were on kitchen business. The apron never left. The mental list never ended. The smell of broth followed you like a second shadow. You were never alone, never off duty, always listening, always remembering. The lady wants quince. The steward needs more barley. The knight is still allergic to garlic, apparently. There is no vacation. No weekend off. No, I just need a moment. Illness was met with a stare. Grief with a shrug. A sprained wrist. Tie a cloth around it and keep stirring. Even sleep felt like a borrowed thing. Something you didn't quite own. Something you might lose if the bell rang early. And it always did. So what happened if, by some miracle, you did leave? Maybe you married. Maybe you retired. Maybe you simply aged out of lifting pots larger than your torso. What then? You didn't become a knight. You didn't buy land. You didn't write a book called Cooking Through the Plague Years. You faded. Gently. Quietly. Sometimes to a cottage by the woods. Sometimes to a room near the bakehouse. Sometimes just to a different kitchen, a smaller fire, a quieter pot. But occasionally, just occasionally, a cook left their mark. A clever recipe passed on to an apprentice. A method for browning meat that spread from castle to castle. A dish remembered by a noble who never quite found soup that good again. Your name didn't make the scrolls, but your stew might have made a memory. And maybe, just maybe, someone whispered your trick for honeyed barley to a new cook decades later and said, that's how she used to do it. And in those rare moments, you lived on. Not in statues, not in songs, but in spice, in soup, in steam. Sometimes, if you were lucky, you ended up in a small village kitchen, surrounded by children who couldn't believe how fast you chopped onions. You taught them to taste the soup with their nose. You told them to watch the bread, not the clock. You showed them how to listen for the moment the fire was ready, the soft crackle, the sigh of heat. They didn't know you'd once fed kings. And you didn't tell them. Because it didn't matter. The truth was, you didn't need to leave the kitchen to move on. The kitchen left with you. It stayed in your hands, in the rhythm of your breath, in the part of your soul that always remembered what rosemary smelled like after a rainstorm. And even if your back ached and your hands were crooked and no one remembered your name, you remembered the roast that came out perfect, the feast that didn't fail, the night you made bread so good someone cried, and that was enough. Because in the end, the castle cook didn't retire. They simmered like a good stew, growing deeper, quieter, richer with time, until one day the fire went out, and someone somewhere said, "Do you remember the way they used to cook?" And someone else nodded, and smiled, and passed the spoon. By now the fire is low. Not out, just resting. Flickering gently like an old memory that knows when it's time to fade. The kitchen is quiet. The knives are cleaned. The spoons are stacked. The pot, still warm, hums a low, satisfied silence. And you, the castle cook, sit for the first time in what feels like forever. Really sit. Not because you're waiting, not because you're between meals, but because finally it's done. You were never in the portraits, never carved into stone. No coat of arms, no family crest, no line in a royal scroll that says, "And lo, the soup was excellent, but your hands built a kingdom just the same. A kingdom of fire and flour, of patience and persistence. A kingdom where every crumb mattered, where every meal held a story, and where survival tasted like turnips and hope. The castle walls may crumble, the tables rot, the banners fall, but somewhere, someone still knows how to boil barley just right, how to twist dough with love, how to smell stew and know it needs just one more pinch of thyme. That's you, still here, still whispering, and maybe a quiet evening in a kitchen far away. Someone ladles soup into a bowl and says, "It just tastes real." They won't know why, but you will, because you're still in the steam, still in the spice, still in the story. This tale wasn't glamorous. It wasn't shiny. It didn't wear a crown or sit on a throne. But it mattered. It mattered in full bellies, in warm hearts, in children who smiled at crusts of bread and nobles who fell quiet over roast. It mattered because you showed up, day after day, meal after meal, without applause, without reward, without rest. You fed a world that barely knew your name. And now, in the hush of the closing kitchen, you can finally rest. Not because there's nothing left to do, but because someone else is stirring the pot now. And you've earned your place at the table. So here's to you, the forgotten hand behind the feast, the quiet heart of the castle, the soul of the soup, the last to eat, the first to rise, the unsung architect of warmth in a cold, cold world. You were never just a cook. You were the fire. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey. If you're still awake or even gently drifting, know that the cook is too. Not gone, just resting, like all good fires do. Good night.